Hi, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. I'm your host, Joe Firestone. Our topics for tonight are failure changes paradigms, okay, as in hoping that the Israeli paradigm will change before too long. Also, truthful work and its importance. Russia comes into balance of power politics, that is to say, in Western Asia. And finally, our topic of almost saying no. That is the United States almost saying no. So I'm going to get right on it. And Lana Dell is here and says, howdy. Steve Wolfbrand says, hello, everybody. Hi, Steve. And I'm going to start right in with failure changes paradigms. And an article from the UNS Review called Israel Does What It Does. It was always planned this way by Alistair Crook. The article was published on October 14th, 2024. And here's a graphic. We see a photo of missiles hitting Israel, the Iranian missiles. And on one side, we see what I believe is Hezbollah's flag. And on the other side, the Israeli flag. The caption is, playing nice won't change its paradigm. Failure does. And the reference is to Israel. With the assassination of Sayed Hassan Nasrallah and a number of the Hezbollah senior leadership in Beirut, expressly without prior warning being given to the Pentagon, Netanyahu fired the start gun on an implicit Israeli widening of war, to use Israel's terms. The, quote, octopus tentacles, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Ansar Allah in Yemen, the Syrian government, and the Iraqi Hashd Ashabi forces. Never was clear on the name of the Iraqi resistance, but there it is, Hashd Ashabi. Well, after the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh and part of Hezbollah's leadership cadre, including a senior Iranian general, Iran, demonized as the, quote, octopus head, unquote, entered the conflict with a volley of missiles that targeted airfields, military bases, and the Mossad HQ, but intentionally caused no deaths. And that is an accurate statement. There was one death, but it was unintentionally caused. It was the death of a Palestinian who was killed due to flying objects. Israel thus made the U.S. and most of Europe partners or accomplices to a war now definitively cast as neo-imperialism versus the whole of the non-West. Palestinians, the global icons of the aspiration for national um, 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 liberation, were to be annihilated from historic Palestine. Further, the bombing in Beirut and Iran's riposte to it now ranges Israel back and materially supported by the U.S. versus Iran, backed and materially supported by Russia. Israel, the military correspondent of Yedioth Aronoth, warns, quote, must go crazy and strike Iran because striking Iran, quote, will end the current war, unquote. Plainly, it marks the end to, quote, playing nice, unquote, of incrementally escalating one calculated step after another, as if playing chess with an opponent who calculates similarly. Both now threaten to take a hammer to the chessboard. Quote, chess is over. It seems that Moscow too understands that chess simply cannot be played when the opponent is no, quote, adult, unquote, but a reckless sociopath ready to sweep away the board, to gamble all on an, quote, ephemeral great victory, unquote, move. Looked at dispassionately, either the Israelis are inviting their own demise by overextending across 7 fronts, or their hope lies with invoking the threat of their demise as the means to bring in the United States. As with Zelensky in Ukraine, there is, quote, no hope, unquote, unless the U.S. adds its firepower decisively, both Netanyahu and Zelensky assume. Excuse me. So in West Asia, the U.S. is now supporting no less than a war against humanity per se and against the world. This clearly cannot be in America's self-interest. Do its power broker panjandrums realize the possible consequences for it to stand against the world in an act of gross immorality? Netanyahu is betting his house, and now the West's, on the outcome of his roulette table bet, quote unquote. Is there a sense among the panjandrums that the U.S. is betting on the wrong horse? While it seems there are some contrarians placed at a high level in the U.S. military who do have reservations, as in every, quote, war game, unquote, the U.S. loses in the Middle East, their voices are few. The wider political class clamors for revenge on Iran. The dilemma of why there are so few opposing voices in Washington has been addressed and explained by Professor Michael Hudson. Hudson explains that matters are not so simple, that context is missing. Professor Hudson's reply is paraphrased below from 2 long commentaries, and then he links to the sources of the commentaries. Quote, everything that's happened today was planned out just 50 years ago, back in 1974 and 1973. Quote again, I worked at the Hudson Institute for about 5 years, 1972 to 1976. I sat in on meetings with Uzi Arad, who became Netanyahu's chief military advisor after heading Mossad. I worked very closely with Uzi there. This guy is named after the Uzi machine gun. Actually, it's submachine gun. I want to describe how the whole strategy that led to the United States today, not wanting peace, but wanting Israel to take over the whole Near East, took place, or took shape, I should say, gradually. Quote again. On one occasion, I brought my mentor, Terence McCarthy, to the Hudson Institute to talk about the Islamic worldview. And every two sentences, Uzi would interrupt, quote, no, no, we've got to kill them all, unquote. And other people, the members of the Institute, were also just talking continually about killing Arabs, unquote. So going on with Alistair's commentary, the strategy of using Israel as the battering ram to achieve U.S. imperial objectives was worked out essentially in the 1960s by Senator Henry, quote, Scoop, unquote, Jackson, who, by the way, was the original senator from Boeing. Yeah, here he says Jackson was nicknamed, quote, the senator from Boeing, unquote, for his support for the military-industrial complex, and also, no doubt, for the ample donations he got from Boeing. That was my comment. And the military-industrial complex backed him to become chair of the Democratic National Committee. He was, too, twice an unsuccessful candidate for the nomination of the Democratic Party for the 1972 and 1976 presidential elections. Well, he was backed by Herman Kahn, too, who became the key strategist for U.S. hegemony in the Hudson Institute. At first, Israel didn't really play a role in the U.S. plan. Jackson, of Norwegian descent, I had no idea Jackson was a Norwegian name, simply hated communism. He hated the Russians and had a lot of support within the Democratic Party. But when all of this strategy was being put together, Herman Kahn's great achievement was to convince the U.S. empire builders that the key to achieving their control in the Middle East was to rely on Israel as its foreign legion. That arm's length arrangement enabled the U.S. to play the role, Hudson says, of the, quote, good cop, unquote, while designating Israel to play its role as a ruthless proxy. That's why the State Department turned over management of U.S. diplomacy to Zionists to separate and distinguish Israeli behavior from the claimed probity of U.S. imperialism. Herman Kahn, and by the way, he's misspelling Kahn's name here, which I think was K-A-H-N, as you know, K-H-A-N. I wonder if the misspelling is actually deliberate. Anyway, described the virtue of Jackson for Zionists to Professor Hudson as precisely that he was not Jewish. He also a defender of the military complex and a strong opponent of the arms control system that was underway. Jackson fought against arms control, quote, we've got to have war, unquote. And he proceeded to stuff the State Department and other U.S. agencies with neocons, Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl, and Douglas Feith, whose name here is also misspelled. He spells it as F-I-F-E, when the spelling of Feith's name is F-E-I-T-H. Again, that particular misspelling could be deliberate, could be a pun. Okay, because a fife, of course, is what they play when they're marching on to war. Anyway, Douglas Feith, among others, who from the beginning planned for permanent worldwide war. The takeover of government policy was led by Jackson's former Senate aides. Herman's analysis was systems analysis. Firstly, define the overall aim and then work backwards. Quote, well, you can see what the Israeli policy is today. First of all, you isolate the Palestinians into strategic hamlets. That's what Gaza had already been turned into for the last 15 years. The aim all along has been to kill them. Well, first of all, to make life so unpleasant. And this, by the way, these are quotes now from Hudson. Well, first of all, to make life so unpleasant for them that they'll emigrate. That's the easy way. Why don't you even want to stay in Gaza when what's happening to them is what's happening today? You're going to leave. But if they don't leave, you're going to have to kill them. Ideally by bombing, because that will minimize domestic casualties, unquote, says Hudson. And quote again, and nobody seems to have noticed that what is happening in Gaza and the West Bank now is all based on the strategic hamlets, quote unquote, idea from the Vietnam War. The fact that you could just divide all of Vietnam into little parts, having guards at all the transition points from one part to another. Everything that Israel is doing to the Palestinians in Gaza and elsewhere throughout Israel was pioneered in Vietnam. Well, not sure I entirely agree with this. I thought it was actually pioneered in the Bantustans of South Africa. But anyway, if you analyze these neocons, Hudson relates, quote, again, they had a virtual religion. I met many at the Hudson Institute. Some of them or their fathers were Trotskyists. I think actually Michael Hudson was a Trotskyist, but his father was a Trotskyist. And they picked up Trotsky's idea of permanent revolution. That is, an unfolding revolution, whereas Trotsky said began in Soviet Russia, was going to spread around the world. So the neocons adapted this and said, quote, no, the permanent revolution is the American empire. It's going to expand and expand, and nothing can stop us to the entire world, unquote. The Scoop Jackson neocons were brought in from the beginning to do exactly what they're doing today, to empower Israel as America's proxy, to conquer the oil-producing countries, and make them part of greater Israel. God, amazing. And here's another quote from Michael Hudson. And the aim of the United States was always oil. That meant the United States had to secure the Near East, and there were two proxy armies to do it. And these two armies fought together as allies down to today. On the one hand, okay, the Al-Qaeda jihadis. On the other hand, their managers, the Israelis, hand in hand, unquote. Quote, what we're seeing is, as I said, a charade that somehow what Israel is doing is, quote, all Netanyahu's fault, all the fault of the right wing there, unquote, And yet, from the very beginning, they were promoted, supported with huge amounts of money, all the bombs they needed, all the armaments they needed, all the funding they needed. All of that was given to them precisely to do exactly what they're doing today, unquote. Quote again, there can't be a two-state solution because Netanyahu said, quote, we hate the Gazans, we hate the Palestinians, we hate the Arabs. There cannot be a two-state solution. Here's my map, quote, before the United Nations. I'm sorry, that was an unquote. Before the United Nations, quote again, here's Israel. There's no one who's not Jewish in Israel. We're a Jewish state. He comes right out and says it, unquote. Hudson then gets to the bottom of it all. He points to the fundamental game changer. Why it is difficult for the U.S. to change its approach. The Vietnam War had shown that any attempted conscription by Western democracies was not viable. And then Johnson in 1968 had to withdraw from running for election precisely because everywhere he would go, there would be non-stop, stop the war demonstrations. The quote, bedrock, unquote, which Hudson underlines, is the understanding that Western democracies no longer can field a domestic army through conscription. Quote, and what that means is that today's tactics are limited to bombing, but not occupying countries. Thus, Israel, whose forces are limited, can drop bombs on Gaza and Hezbollah and try to knock things out. But neither the Israeli army nor any other army would really be able to invade and take over a country or even the southern part of Lebanon in the way that armies did in World War II. So the U.S. drew the lesson. It turned to proxies. And here's another quote from Hudson. So what is left for the United States? Well, I think there's only one form of non-atomic war that democracies can afford, and that's terrorism, i.e. positively seeking huge collateral deaths. And I think you should look at Ukraine and Israel as the terrorist alternative to atomic war, unquote, Hudson suggests. That's really an interesting framing of what we're going through right now, I think. Going on with the article from Alistair Crook. The bottom line, he notes, is what then does this imply with Israel continuing to insist on engaging the U.S. in this regional war? The United States is not going to send troops. It can't do that. The ruling cadre have tried terrorism, and the result of terrorism is to align the rest of the world against the West, appalled by the wanton killing and by the breaking of all the rules of war. Hudson concludes, quote, I don't see Congress being reasonable. I think that the State Department, National Security Agency, and the Democratic Party leadership, with its basis in the military-industrial complex, is absolutely committed, unquote. The latter might say, quote again, well, who wants to live in a world where we can't control? Who wants to live in a world where other countries are independent, where they have their own policy? Who wants to live in a world where we can't siphon off their economic surplus for us? If we can't take everything and dominate the world, well, who wants to live in that kind of world? And Alistair Crook concludes, that's the mentality with which we're dealing. Quote, playing nice won't change that paradigm. Failure does. Failure does. This piece was originally published by Strategic Culture Foundation If I took it from there, of course, I would certainly face some discipline from Facebook. Whether that is the case in taking it from the UN's review, that remains to be seen. I thought that was an interesting argument, though, from Alistair, and I wonder what you think. Excuse me for a moment while I share this video. I'm afraid I forgot to do that. Fortunately, Dolores Pierce shared it for me. So thank you, Dolores. Okay, so Evelina says the topics are excellent. Thank you, Evelina. Okay, everybody says hello to everybody else. And Dee says shared to Facebook and Twitter. Thank you, Dee. Steve says shared around Facebook. Thank you very much, Steve. Robert Copeland says, why can't there be a treaty where both sides benefit? Both sides, I think, don't want peace. I'm not sure which two sides you're talking about. Inside of Ukraine, of course, there are two sides, but the only side or the only position that actually benefits Russia would be a position where the state of Ukraine is neutral. And Ukraine rejected that in April of 2022 at the urging of Boris Johnson, who was talking both for the UK and for the United States. So I think that what Ukraine decided at that point is that it didn't want peace. Robert says, anything by Scott Ritter tonight so I can leave early tonight? No, I'm afraid there's nothing from Scott Ritter here tonight. Steve says Israel does not want peace, and I think that's right. Lana says, wow, this gets worse and worse the more I learn. Yesterday, listening to Jeff Sachs say Netanyahu lured us into war in Iraq, Afghanistan. Now, this history by Michael Hudson. Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it, Lana? Lana says, please all hit that like button, share, and subscribe. Yeah, I should say that myself. Lana says, I also just shared to Twitter and FB. Thank you, Lana. Evil sinners. What can change the Israeli paradigm is failure. Agreed. I have to remark here that Israel is going through failure right now. It's failing in Lebanon. It has failed, in Gaza. I think it expected to have a victory there within a few weeks. Certainly did not anticipate a war that would be longer than a year. So it has failed there. And it's failing in the exchanges with Iran as well. John B. said, Hudson's book, quote, Super Imperialism, really opened my eyes to the reality of U.S. tactics to dominate any potential adversary. And U.S. strategy also, right, to dominate any potential strategy. Should be on the curriculum as a history reference. Robert Copeland says, I have no respect for Scott Ritter as everything from his pro-Russian, what? I certainly think that Scott is really extremely pro-American and is trying to get us to do what's best for us. Okay, at this point. Scott has a tremendous amount of love, okay, for this country. And in his own way, he has served it continuously for more than 40 years. Steve Wolfbrand says, watch um, Katie Halper. John B. says, the truth hurts. Very often the truth hurts. And that's a very good segue to our next piece. And that piece is by Patrick Lawrence. And it has the wonderful title, the really wonderful title, Truths That Come Out Like the Sun. I also picked this up, at Un's Review. It was published there on October 13th. This is a photo of voices from Gaza, women's stories. Kolud, unquote, by UN Women Arab States, is licensed under Creative Commons CC by SA 2.0. I read the other day the latest paper put out by those good people who run the Costs of War project at Brown University's Watson Institute. It is called, quote, United States Spending on Israel's military operations and related U.S. operations in the region, October 7th, 2023 to September 30th, 2024, unquote. And there's all sorts of information in it. Since the Zionist state began its latest assault on the Palestinians of Gaza a year ago, the Biden regime has spent $22.76 billion financing it. And this is a very conservative figure given by the three authors who wrote the piece. That same paper has a remarkable graph showing the growth of the U.S. military aid to Israel, grants and loans in constant 2024 dollars during the 65 years from 1959, when it was zero, to this year when it reached $18 billion. There was a sharp spike in the years following the 1967 war, when the policy cliques in Washington began to consider the Zionist state a strategic asset in the region. Then I read a related paper the people at Watson finished recently, quote, The Human Toll, Indirect Deaths from War in Gaza and the West Bank, October 7th, 2023, forward, unquote. Measures and analyzes, as the introduction explains, quote, the impact on population health of the destruction of public infrastructure, livelihood sources, reduced access to health care, water and sanitation, and environmental damage, unquote. Then beginning with the next sentence, the paper starts to hit you hard. For instance, 96%, quote, for instance, 96% of Gaza's population, 2.15 million people, faces acute levels of food insecurity, According to an October 2nd, 2024 letter to President Biden from a group of U.S. physicians, 62,413 people in Gaza have died of starvation. As it happens, I had already read the letter, the Watson report, and mentioned an open letter that 99 physicians and other American medical professionals wrote to President Biden and Vice President Harris after serving in Gaza this past year. It reads in part, quote, "This letter and the appendix show probative evidence that the human toll in Gaza since October is far higher than is understood in the United States. It is likely that the death toll from this conflict is already greater than 118,908. With only marginal exceptions, everyone, and that is in italics, in Gaza is sick, injured, or both. This includes every national aid worker, every international volunteer, and probably every Israeli hostage, every man, woman, and child," unquote. The physician letter seems to be one of numerous put out by this group under the title, quote, "Gaza Healthcare Letters," unquote. One of the organizers of the group is Firoz Sidwa, a West Coast trauma surgeon who has been energetically getting out the truth of the Gaza crisis for some time. The newest letter arrived, and my thanks to both, via John Whitbeck, an American attorney who puts out an informative blog from his home in Paris, and Dave DeCamp's excellent piece in antiwar.com. Right after I read the physician's letter and the DeCamp piece and the costs of war material, I watched the documentary Al Jazeera's investigative unit put out October 3rd as a sort of 1 year on project, quote, "Investigating War Times in Gaza," unquote, is an hour of 20 minutes of gut-turning footage so powerful it makes you conclude there's simply no lower limit to the Zionists' depravity, while you wonder, as many of us have this past year, what it means to be human. And they link to the YouTube, okay, of the Gaza documentary, okay, from Al Jazeera here. But my advisory, says Patrick Lawrence, the Al Jazeera documentary is very difficult to watch, but we must, as a matter of conscience, and for those who spent the year flinching as a rite of passage, we must let the truth push itself in our faces. My partner's advisory, don't watch it before you go to bed. One day or so after I saw the Al Jazeera film, having already read the Watson reports, the open letter, and the DeCamp commentary, I read Brett Murphy's latest piece in ProPublica, quote, "Inside the State Department's weapons pipeline to Israel," unquote, lays out the whole awful tale. Here, by way of linked diplomatic cables, email, and Murphy's interview work, we see how obsessed all those corporate flunkies at state were and are to get weapons and more weapons to terrorist Israel, at times under pressure from the arms lobbies, while ignoring the vast accretions of evidence that these supplies should have been blocked by law because of the Israelis' genocidal crimes. By the time I read of this, I had already seen Murphy's earlier report that Secretary of State Antony Blinken had suppressed and then lied to Congress about, 2 State Department reports on some of these uh, uh, derelictions. This is official abuse. I am abused. You are abused. And as we are abused, we watch Palestinians, other human beings suffer. You have to admire Brett Murphy for his perspicacity in delivering these truths to us. Even a few years ago, I would have said, I hope the New York Times picks this guy up. No more of that. I hope for Murphy's sake and the sake of his readers, the Times keeps its befouled hands off a fine journalist, and for the sake, I will add, of his fineness. Anyway, a few days after Murphy's piece with Watson Papers, the open letter, and the Al Jazeera footage still in mind, along came the Gray Zone's new documentary, quote, Atrocity Incorporated, How Israel Sells Its Destruction of Gaza, unquote. There is rarely much mercy in Max Blumenthal's work, simply because those he covers rarely deserve any, and this is just such a case. The Israeli Hasbra machine, the New York Times, Sheryl Sandberg, and other such Zionist cretins. The list goes on. In 44 minutes, Blumenthal and Sut Bijali, his director, gives us the whole truth and nothing but about the vast propaganda operation that has been so grotesquely effective in persuading so many people. Starvation, sniper murders of children, ethnic cleansing and genocide are all the right things to do, because in racist caricatures worthy of the Klan, uh, uh, the militias who crossed from Gaza into southern Israel last October 7th went on some kind of utterly implausible rape, beheading, baking babies, murder spree. And there's a link to Max's video, which is roughly about 44 minutes. Patrick Lawrence goes on, nothing like the cold, clear light of day to dispel the smog. On Friday night, I awakened to report in the Middle East Monitor, again, courtesy of John Whitbeck, who likes to make sure we get off to a bushy-tailed start, that one Matthew Brodsky, a former advisor to the White House, just called for the Israelis to carpet bomb an Irish contingent of UN peacekeepers in southern Lebanon, quote, and then drop napalm over it, unquote. Altogether sound and in keeping, too. The day of the Middle East Monitor's report, the Israelis shelled, knowingly with intent, buildings in southern Lebanon from which UN peacekeepers operate. Matthew Brodsky now survives in the Zionist reaches of think tank land in Washington. He is said no longer to advise the White House. Whether he still briefs Congress, the state and defense departments, and the National Security Council as he has in the past is unclear. Either way, as Chaz Freeman, the distinguished former ambassador, points out, this is the kind of person who climbs through the bureaucratic scene in Washington and ends up in advisory roles by dint of extremism dressed up as expertise. After thinking about all this reading and viewing in some shorter time, I didn't want to think about anything for a while. Then I thought of a famous adage of Aeschylus that I used to keep in my desk. Quote, he who learns must suffer, and even in our sleep pain, which cannot forget, falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God, unquote. That, by the way, is some adage. I've never heard it before, but I think perhaps I must learn to keep it, on my desk as well. Suffering, pain, despair. Then I thought of something else. Failing in my recall, I thought of whoever it was who said, quote, "The truth is like the sun. It always comes out," quote. The Israelis are not at war with the Palestinians of Gaza, just as the Reich was not at war with the Jews of Europe. Genocide is something different, and it is always important to name things properly if we are to understand them as they are. But there has indeed been a war raging this past year. It is not as bloody as what Palestinians now endure, and what uh, 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 and what the Lebanese now seem to be in for, but it is arguably just as consequential. This is our war for the truth against those who would bury it in the cause of distorting events, burying reality itself, and specifically of shielding those who conduct the genocide in Gaza. It is a war in the cause of lifting a heavy lid so that the truth can do its work, the work it always does, its work in defense of the human cause. Quote, "Our war," unquote, quote, "we," unquote. I am wary of these words. Who are, quote, "we," unquote, in any given case? But there is a, quote, "we," unquote, now, a very big, crowded, quote, "we," unquote, and we are getting there. We are winning our war. This is what I draw from the past week's journalism as I have reviewed it. A solidly documented true story takes shape out of all the day-to-day reporting of the past year. It is all in the record now, or will be a coherent whole. This while all the official lies and the corporate media lies are exposed. Let us not miss the significance here. Can we not conclude the truth is proving once again as persistent as the sun? A case in point. On October 10th, the Times published a piece I found reviving of the spirit under the headline, quote, "Relentless," unquote. "Israeli attacks on Gaza medical workers are a war crime," a UN panel says. Beneath this was an account of a UN Commission's report that found Israel guilty of, quote, "relentless and deliberate attacks," unquote, on hospitals and other medical facilities, on doctors and other medical professionals, and on civilian patients. The pithy passage in the statement of Navi Pillay, formerly the UN's High Commissioner for Human Rights and the director of the Commission, quote, "Israel has perpetrated a concerted policy to destroy Gaza's healthcare system as part of a broader assault on Gaza, committing war crimes and the crime against humanity of extermination with relentless and deliberate attacks on medical personnel and facilities." Going on with the article, this is the truth rising to the surface. Uh, 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 do you think Pilay's commission would have studied conditions in Gaza and drawn its conclusions without the prompt of the medical people now speaking out, chiefly via independent media? Do you think the Times would have published this piece if circumstances and accumulations of truths too large to inter or ignore had not forced it to do so? At the end of Atrocity, Inc., Max Blumenthal urges those who viewed the footage to speak out and to continue doing so as long as this is possible until the law, he means to say, prohibits free speech. Implicit in this, if I read him correctly, is the conclusion I have just suggested. It matters. Our war is going well, and it is no use waiting for the times to tell us so. Will the truths now emerging at an increasing and encouraging rate reach some critical mass such that either Israel or the U.S. will change policy? It may seem bitter to ask this question, given Israel's escalating barbarities and Washington's indifference even to common decency. But we must not miss the extent to which Israel is destroying itself before our eyes and dragging the U.S. down with it, both in large part because the truth of this crisis has turned world opinion against these two rogue states. The rogue states, of course, being Israel and us. Here's the final paragraph. There are the yet to be written histories of our time to be considered. We all know George Orwell's line in, quote, 1984, unquote. Quote, who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past, unquote. It is essential then to get the record of our time set down accurately, truthfully, such that the way can open to proceeding in a new direction. Let us appreciate the power of the truthful work being done now, some of which I have reviewed with this in mind. And that's it. That's a terrific piece. I am honored to have been able to read it to you and to make the inadequate comments that I was able to make as I read it. This piece was republished from SheerPost by permission of author, okay, or a representative. I'll take a look at your comments now. Evelina says, but what will it take for Israel to admit it has failed? Well, as I've said in previous streams, what I think it may take is a very strong missile attack, 2,000 or so ballistic missiles from the Iranians, including an attack on the settlers in the West Bank, okay, of Israel, such that they are persuaded to leave Israel, not to leave Israel, but to leave the West Bank itself, the occupied territories where they have illegally settled. Even as must Israel itself admit it has failed for failure to occur? No. I think failure, okay, is occurring now, and the Israelis are not admitting it. Robert Copeland says, how much money has the United States sent to Israel since it was formed as a country just after World War II that instead could have benefited the people in the United States? I think the money spent is detailed in some of the reports, which are linked to above. I'm sure it is many, many billions of dollars. I wouldn't be surprised if it were up to 60 billion or 70 billion or something like that, which could have benefited the people, okay, in the United States. But we also have to point out that the fact that this money was given to Israel doesn't mean that an equivalent amount of money could not have been given to the people of the United States for various purposes. Robert says Israel uses the United States as an ATM machine. Absolutely. Evelina says, can it only be a de facto failure? I think it will have to be an admitted failure to some degree, because there are two choices, seems to me. There's the choice of de facto failure, uh, which involves the destruction of Israel, okay, itself, or there could be a public failure, which Israel will have to admit in the course of its accepting, okay, a solution, a two-state solution, okay, imposed by the United Nations and by the rest of the world, okay, upon us. Lana says, what are the change at the UN for the resolutions the U.S. has rejected, now embraced? I don't think those changes are quite enough. They only indicate the Biden uh, uh, administration is getting more and more fed up. But in terms of the war itself, they don't amount to a hill of beans. Lana says, I guess now that Mr. N is not responding to the usual phone call is getting scary to someone at the top. Well, of course, I think the United States is of two minds. There are many people inside the White House, okay, or elsewhere, who want a wider war with Iran right now. And there are others in the Pentagon and in the White House who are saying, no, if we go to war now, we will be defeated uh, uh, by Iran, and it will be another very serious defeat for us that we should avoid, because we are not ready, okay, for war with Iran, but they are ready for war with us. John B. says, it is only with near total control of the media that U.S. elites could achieve and sustain such evil deeds. Goebbels was right. He failed only because he didn't have today's info technology. Well, I think that observation is a wonderful one, John B. I don't know if I entirely agree with it, but I certainly appreciate it. John B. points out that can never be a two-state solution while Israel won't renounce their apartheid state. And I agree with that too. That is where Israel is going to have to admit, okay, its failure. Because accepting a solution like that, okay, a two-state solution, okay, a negotiated one, will involve that Israel renunciate their apartheid state. No more apartheid state. So, I'm now going to go on with a third topic, okay, which is Russia comes in. That's a piece by, okay, I believe, okay, it's Mike Whitney, if I recall correctly, yes. If Israel attacks, Russia is not going to stay on the sideline. This was from October 12th. And there's a picture of Vladimir Putin. Under it is a quote from Zbigniew Brzezinski, who is the father of the view that the international system is a grand chessboard, and that it's necessary for the U.S. to play on that chessboard in such a way as to prevent any other power from dominating the world island of Eurasia. And of course, what's happening now is the rest of the world is fixing to be dominant in Eurasia and to cast out the influence of the United States. That is what BRICS is about. That is what the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is about. And that is the larger picture of what is happening right now. It serves as the context for the war in Ukraine and the context also for the war in West Asia. Let's take this quote, though, because it is a wise quote. I don't think there is an implicit obligation for the United States to follow like a stupid mule whatever Israelis do. If they decide to start a war simply on the assumption that we'll automatically be drawn into it, I think it is the obligation of friendship to say, quote, you're not going to be making a national decision for us, unquote. I think that the United States has the right to have its own national security policy, unquote. And Zabig said that. I hope his daughter was listening when he said that. And that she, and Morning Joe will point out in no uncertain terms that the Israelis should not be making a national decision for us, that we have to make the decision as to whether we're getting involved in a wider war. And we have to do that in the face of the influence of AIPAC and other members of the Israel lobby. Going on with the article, the U.S. foreign policy establishment used to include men who were capable of strategic thinking. No more. What passes for strategic thinking now is the endless reiteration of Israeli talking points uttered by retired generals who are owned by the weapons industry and the Israeli lobby. These men, who represent the views of an infinitesimal percentage of the overall population, are an essential part of a larger machine that prepares the public for intervention, escalation, and war. Their current assignment is to convince the American people that Israel's impending attack on Iran serves America's national security interests, which, of course, it doesn't. In fact, the country is being boondoggled into a bloody conflagration that will, in all probability, precipitate a sharp decline in U.S. global power, followed by a swift end to the so-called American century. All of this was forecast by one of America's most scholarly foreign policy analysts, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who delivered a warning on the topic of Iran more than a decade ago in an op-ed in the Los Angeles Times. So the person who created the vision of the grand chessboard himself warned of a war with Iran. Here's what he said, quote, an attack on Iran would be an act of political folly, setting in motion a progressive upheaval in world affairs, with the U.S. increasingly the object of widespread hostility. The era of American preponderance could even come to a premature end. Although the United States is clearly dominant in the world at the moment, this was once again as of a decade ago, it is neither the power nor the domestic inclination to impose and then to sustain its will in the face of protracted and costly resistance. Quote again, it is therefore high time for the administration to sober up and think strategically with a historic perspective and the U.S. It's time to cool the rhetoric. The United States should not be guided by emotions or a sense of religiously inspired sense of mission. Our choice is either to be stampeded into a reckless adventure, profoundly damaging to long-term U.S. national interests, or to become serious about by giving negotiations with Iran a genuine chance. Treating Iran with respect and within a historical perspective would help to advance that objective. U.S. policy should not be swayed by the current contrived atmosphere of urgency, ominously reminiscent of what preceded the misguided intervention in Iraq. Been there, done that, unquote. Well said. One can only wish that the lame-brained pundits on cable news would circulate the article among themselves. And I have to add, speaking of those pundits, I only wish that Mika Brzezinski would circulate the article among the other lame brains on cable news. Like him or hate him, Brzezinski provided a coherent, well-researched analysis that dispassionately evaluated whether the costs of a particular operation were greater than the benefits. In this case, there is simply no comparison. The U.S. is rushing towards a conflict that serves no national interest, that it can't win, and that will have a catastrophic impact on the nation's future. Here's Brzezinski again. Quote, we do not need to increase the scale of the conflict in the region because an increase in conflict involving the Iranians would likely reignite the conflict in Iraq, would set the Persian Gulf ablaze, would increase the price of oil twofold, threefold, fourfold. Europe would become even more dependent on Russia for its energy. So what is the benefit to us? All I know as an analyst of international politics is a war with Iran. This would be a disaster. And frankly, I think it will be a disaster for us more than for Israel, because as a result of the war, we will be forced out of the region because of the dynamic hatred that develops. And I have no illusions about it. If the conflict spreads, we're going to be alone. And if we are driven out, how much would you bet on the survival of Israel for more than 5 or 10 years? Unquote. Okay, from Zibig, from from an interview he had on the Real News Network. The Real News, of course, still exists and does very valuable work. But Zibig, of course, okay, is dead now. Okay, and his video is quoted in this article, and you could see it there. So it would not just be disastrous for the United States, but disastrous for Israel as well, which, absent Washington's, quote, unconditional, unquote, support, would wither on the vine in 5 or 10 years. I don't even think it's going to take 5 or 10 years. If we're defeated by Iran, that means that Israel would also be defeated by Iran. And that means it would be lucky to continue to exist, as Scott Ritter has been recently pointing out. If the Iranians will reply to an attack by the Israelis with 2,000 of their missiles sent to Israel, that would destroy the energy resources of Israel, the water resources of Israel, the infrastructure of Israel. Israel would be bombed back, to the Stone Age by those 2,000 missiles, quite a few of which would be hypersonic. I'm going on with the article. Perhaps there are some who would disagree with this analysis. Perhaps there are some who think that a tiny belligerent colony at the heart of the Arab world that has made every effort to make itself a damn nuisance for the last 75 years could survive without the assistance of the U.S. It's possible, I suppose, but not likely. This is from an article at NBC News on Saturday. Quote, U.S. officials believe Israel has narrowed down what they will target in their response to Iran's attack, which these officials describe as Iranian military and energy infrastructure. There is no indication that Israel will target nuclear facilities or carry out further assassinations. But U.S. officials stress that the Israelis have not made a final decision about how and when to act. But the U.S. does not know when Israel's response would come, but officials said the Israeli military is poised and ready to go at any time once the order is given. U.S. and Israeli officials said a response could come during the Yom Kippur holiday. Of course, that holiday is now past. The U.S. is poised to defend its assets in the region from any immediate counterattack from Iran, but is not likely to provide direct military support to the operation. Well, if the U.S. does not supply support to the operation, then the Iranians would probably refrain from attacking the U.S. bases. But as I covered in a previous stream, the multiple U.S. bases surrounding Iran, how many were there? 35, some huge amount of bases surrounding Iran. If they provide any direct support to Israel in its attack, then Iran has said it will attack them. And it's clear Iran has the missile resources to do so, and that those bases are sitting ducks. And I went over that a few streams ago, or maybe it was on Saturday, I forget. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin spoke with his Israeli counterpart, still quoting now, by Yoav Gallant last night, and they discussed broad strokes about an Israeli response. However, it's not clear that Gallant provided any concrete details. On Saturday, and I'm now going on with the article, I'm off the quote, onto the article again. More than 10 articles appeared on Google News with the exact same byline, quote, Israel has narrowed down what they will target, unquote. The impression this mantra is supposed to create is that Israel's blatant act of aggression is actually a measured and thoughtful act of self-defense. What a joke. And what a humiliation for the Biden administration, who are not even informed as to how their bombs, their jets, their refueling aircraft, and their logistical support are going to be used. When did the U.S. become such a spineless patsy that allows itself to be pushed around by the gangsters in Tel Aviv. It's shocking. I have to say here, we're not being pushed around by the gangsters, okay, in Tel Aviv, as much as we're being pushed around by the donors here in the United States, by the lobby, by the rich, by the large corporations that, for reasons of their own self-interest, insist that we support Israel unconditionally, however bad the behavior, okay, of Israel is. We've become spineless patsies to the donors. That's what's going on. And that means we're spineless patsies for the donors' clients, which are the Israelis, of course. What's lost in the hullabaloo surrounding Israel's upcoming attack on Iran is the fact that Russia has been stealthily concluding its own diplomatic campaign aimed at strengthening Iran's defenses and preparing for the hostilities ahead. On Friday, Putin met with Iranian President uh, President Masoud Pezeshkian, okay, in Ashgabat, Turkmenistan, to discuss the deteriorating situation in the Middle East and the probability of a regional war. The carefully choreographed meeting was intended to show that Russia regards Iran as both a friend and ally who can depend on Russia's support if hostilities break out. Hours earlier, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov issued an ominous warning that an Israeli strike on Iran's civilian nuclear facilities would constitute a, quote, serious provocation, unquote. Speaking at a news conference in Laos, Lavrov emphasized that according to the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, Iran has remained compliant with current regulations and has not diverted any nuclear material to banned weapons programs. Israel's spurious claims on this matter are pure propaganda. Here's a quote from Lavrov. If any plans or threats to attack the Islamic Republic of Iran's peaceful nuclear facilities are realized, it would indeed be a very serious provocation. Between Lavrov's comments and Putin's meeting, there's little doubt that Moscow supports Iran in its clash with Israel, although it is not possible to know whether Russia will actively intervene if the war breaks out. We should also remember that Russia's Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin visited Tehran just 2 days ago before Iran launched its ballistic missile attack on Israel. This suggests that Iran got the green light from Moscow to take action that corresponds with Putin's idea of a, quote, proportionate response, unquote. The point we're making is that Russia is following developments very closely and has moved its military assets to within range of the prospective battle space. It is logical to assume that Russia will engage Iran's enemies if that is what the situation requires. Okay, and military analyst Will Shriver summed it up like this. Quote, I cannot understand how more people do not fully appreciate that fighting alongside Iran against the empire is not a choice for Russia, but an existential imperative. It is also something for which the Russians have feverishly prepared since no later than the summer of 2022. Going on with the article, keep in mind, Russia and Iran have significantly strengthened their military ties over the last few years to the point they're openly committed to each other's security. Here is Shriver again, quote again, Russia, China, and Iran have now formed a de facto military and economic alliance, what they prefer to call a, quote, partnership, unquote. In the case of Russia and China, a comprehensive full-spectrum partnership has emerged. uh, 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 military, economic, and monetary. Quote again, Russia, China, and Iran conduct regular joint exercises in the Arabian Sea. These exercises have increased in both scope and frequency in recent years. Both Russia and China are investing vast sums of capital in Iran, much of it in the energy sector and in ambitious transportation projects aiming to construct fast and efficient trade corridors linking China, Iran, and Russia as primary modes of Eurasian commerce. Arms and technology transfers between the three countries have reached unprecedented levels. Quote again, it is increasingly evident that Russia, China, and Iran recognize an attack against any one of them would constitute an existential threat to them all. The strategic interests of all three countries are now inextricably intertwined. Most importantly, they're united in a single overriding strategic objective to dismantle the dominion of the long reigning Anglo American empire. And quote, yet again, still from Will Shriver, in a putative war between the United States and Iran, both Russia and China would actively support Iran. Iran would simply be supplemented with arms and other logistical necessities for both its partners, and quite possibly taken under their nuclear umbrella in an explicit act of deterrence. To the extent Russia, China, and Iran are determined to act all for one and one for all, they represent the combination of global military and economic power that cannot be defeated. This is from an article by Will Shriver, or a statement on Twitter. All for one and one for all. Going on with the article, or going back to the article, Shriver's view is shared by a great many analysts who naturally are banned from sharing their opinions in the major media. But that doesn't change the underlying fact that Russia and Iran, excuse me, are strategic allies that will intervene militarily if they find themselves in peril. It's worth noting that Iran provides China with 15% of its oil. That's China's top oil producer. Is an active participant in the International North-South Transport Corridor, which is a 4,500-mile-long multi-mode network of ship, rail, and road route for moving trade between India, Iran, Azerbaijan, Russia, Central Asia, and Europe, and is, quote, situated at the crossroads of Central Asia, South Asia, and the Arab states in the Middle East, unquote. Going on with a larger quote, Iran's strategic positioning and its vast natural resources make it a critical part of the emerging multipolar world that is fast replacing Washington's threadbare rules-based system. Neither Russia nor China can allow Iran to be decimated or its government to be ousted. Here's more background from author Dr. Digby James Wren on Substack. Quote, Russia's president has authorized the signing of a comprehensive strategic partnership agreement with Iran. This follows a Tehran visit by the Secretary of the Russian Security Council, preceded by a trip to St. Petersburg by the Iranian National Security Advisor. Putin reportedly describing it as, quote, expedient, unquote, and to be signed, quote, at the highest level, unquote. According to Iranian media, Putin hailed the, quote, strategic, unquote, relations between Tehran and Moscow, which he said had grown stronger in recent years. Relations between Moscow and Tehran have deepened considerably since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Yes, Tehran was extremely important in Moscow's effort, shipping numerous drones of its own manufacturer to Russia for use in the war against Ukraine. And those drones were very successful in that war, by the way. Going on with the quote, cooperation between the two countries has become particularly pronounced in the military domain. Oh, here it is. Iran has supplied drones to Russia, which have reportedly been deployed against Ukraine. Additionally, Iran is believed to be supporting Russia's efforts to localize drone production. Quote, relations with Iran are a priority for us, but Putin said to Pezeshkian. Reports also emerged in August about alleged Russian arms shipments being delivered to Iran. The New York Times cited Iranian officials at the time as saying that Russia had begun to transfer radar and air defense equipment to Tehran following a request made to the Kremlin. This quote appeared in Persian Fire. Dr. Digby James Wren Substack. So the title of the article was Persian Fire. In other words, Putin anticipated the crisis that is unfolding today and began vigorously shoring up Iran's defenses. Now they're ready to go. Check it out. And here's a quote from Andrei Gurlev, Russian Lieutenant General at DD underscore the geopolitics, which is double down geopolitics. Quote, the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, Vladimir Putin, discussed the situation in the Middle East and set tasks that can only be discussed face-to-face. We will monitor the development of events. The army is ready and the initiative is on our side. Victory will be ours, maybe not quickly, but we will definitely win. That's a quote from Gurlev, the Russian Lieutenant General. What we should expect now is an Israeli attack on Iran's vital infrastructure, amplified by a decapitation operation aimed at its political and military leaders. The attack will have to exceed what U.S. advisors have suggested in order to increase the chances of an exaggerated retaliation from Iran that will prompt Washington's entry into the war, which is Israel's main objective. In other words, Israel is warring against us, against our national interest. Iran's response will be shaped in part by Russia, who will emphasize a, quote, proportionate response, unquote. Putin will give Israel and the United States every opportunity to, quote, lower the temperature, unquote, and de-escalate. But if they decide to intensify their attacks, we should expect the worst case scenario. There's no way the United States comes out of a war with Iran unscathed. These are momentous times in which the cornerstone upon which the old order rests is disintegrating before our eyes. Says Mike Whitney, and that is the end of his post, which I think was a great piece of analysis and very, very insightful. And I'm looking forward to your comments on it. So, we are still at 53 folks here. Comment, okay, from Evelina. Why was the American century declared such? Even a decade ago, was that the idea? I thought the American century actually began in 1914, but I may be mistaken at that. Lana says, according to Jeff Sachs, Iran has stated over and over they don't want war with the U.S. Yes, according to me, I've also stated over and over that they don't want war with the U.S. Scott Ritter has stated over and over they don't war with the U.S. Colonel Wilkerson has stated over and over they don't want war with uh, uh, the U.S. Colonel McGregor has stated over and over they don't want war with the U.S. Trita Parsi has stated over and over they don't want war with the U.S. Evelyn has asked, did it become the idea after 2001? I think it became the idea even before, sometime in the 1990s or 1980s. In our arrogance, we began to call it the American century. Robert says, right now, I think anybody will use nuclear weapons, but cyber warfare could be used, probably will be used too. And choosy heretics choose carnation revolution now. Copeland, spell his name correctly, it's Copeland, Coplin. You do well to acknowledge Lyndon B. Johnson's entitlements and exemptions to the Jesuit order would include Jesuit Israeli interests in the fold of the larger pie of domestic dominance. And choosy heretics choose carnation revolution now made the correction to Robert's name himself in the comment right after. And choosy heretics choose carnation revolution now. Got to abbreviate that. CHCCR. CHCCR, yeah. CHCCRN. CHCCRN, okay. So CHCCRN said Jesuit Zionist conspiracy has a first name. And CHCCRN says, try to remember, and don't you forget, the October surprise is the history of Pope Clement XIV, the expeller of Jesuit order from 80 nations attempting to rid the world of it in 1773, but unsuccessfully, I think, and probably a good thing, because the Jesuit order has a high sense of ethics and trains some people to have a fine sense of ethics as well out of their Jesuit schools. CHCCRN says, might I remind you, we are only at halftime of October surprise, surprise, surprise. Yes, we are only at halftime, right. And the things we think have been October surprises may not be the one we remember as the October surprise. And CHCCRN says, I hope you are entertained. The marching band will now take the field. And CHCCRN says, hold on to your hats. There might be a wardrobe failure or two. Evelina says, okay, 1914, the century before this one. Yeah. Yes, I think so. So now let's move to the final topic for tonight, which is almost saying no. And that one comes from an article from Common Dreams called Biden finally threatens to halt arms to Israel over Gaza carnage. Quote, we should not wait 30 days, unquote. One group argued, quote, U.S. law requires ending the weapons now, unquote. This piece is by Jessica Corbett. It was published today, October 15, 2024. This is a developing story. Please check back for possible updates. After a year of outrage over U.S. support for Israel's devastating assault on the Gaza Strip, multiple media outlets reported Tuesday that the Biden administration threatened to cut off U.S. weapons if the Israeli government doesn't take, quote, urgent and sustained actions, unquote, to improve humanitarian conditions in the Palestinian territory within 30 days. The October 13th letter from U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. It's addressed to Israeli Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant and Minister of Strategic Affairs Ron Dermer. Axios reporter Barak Ravid published images of the letter on social media, and the Washington Post reported that its, quote, authenticity was confirmed by U.S. and Israeli officials. Blinken and Austin noted requirements under federal law, which critics of the war have often cited in arguments that continuing to provide Israel with weapons is illegal. And National Security Memorandum 20, which President Joe Biden issued in February, NSM 20 directs the Secretary of State, quote, to obtain certain credible and reliable written assurances from foreign governments, unquote, that they use U.S. arms in line with international humanitarian law and will not, quote, arbitrarily deny, restrict, or otherwise impede directly or indirectly the transport or delivery of United States humanitarian assistance. And there's a tweet, from Dr. Renel Shelaine. Clear acknowledgement that the administration knows 620I is being violated. That's the U.S. code number of the law. Under U.S. law, this renders Israel ineligible to receive American weapons or security resistance. And that was a quote tweet of a tweet by Barak Ravid. Secretary of State Blinken and Secretary of State Austin sent a letter on Monday to Israel demanding it take steps within 30 days to improve the humanitarian situation in Gaza in order to avoid consequences in U.S. law for military aid to Israel. See the letter here. The U.S. secretaries wrote that, quote, to reverse the downward humanitarian trajectory inconsistent with its assurances to us, Israel must, starting now within 30 days, act on the following concrete measures. Failure to demonstrate a sustained commitment to implementing and maintaining these measures may have implications for U.S. policy under NSM 20 and relevant U.S. law. May? Why should it may? It must, because it would be a violation of U.S. law to do otherwise. The letter calls on the Israeli government to, quote, surge all forms of humanitarian assistance throughout Gaza with a list of specific actions. It also demands that Israel, quote, ensure that commercial and Jordan armed forces, JAF corridors, are functioning at full and continuous capacity, unquote, and, quote, end the isolation in northern Gaza, unquote, while acknowledging concerns about Israel's unverified allegations that a small number of staff from UN RWA for Palestine, the refugees in the Near East, were involved in the Hamas-led October 7, 2023 attack. Blinken and Austin also expressed alarm about Knesset's potential adoption of UN RWA legislation that, quote, would devastate the Gaza humanitarian response at this critical moment and deny vital educational and social services to tens of thousands of Palestinians in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, which could have implications under relevant U.S. law and policy, unquote. As CNN reported Tuesday, Israel appears to already be responding to the letter, at least indirectly, just one day after the letter was sent. COGAT, the Israeli agency that manages policy for the Palestinian territories, and the flow of aid into the Strip, tweeted photos of aid going into Gaza. Quote, 30 trucks entered northern Gaza through the Eretz crossing earlier today. Israel is not preventing the entry of humanitarian aid with an emphasis on food into Gaza, unquote. Kogat said in a post on X, quote, Israel will continue to allow the entry of humanitarian aid to the residents of Gaza while simultaneously destroying Hamas governance and military infrastructures, unquote. However, since Sunday, Israel has also continued killing civilians in Gaza, bombing a hospital complex and refugee camps, actions that have led progressive U.S. lawmakers to call on Biden to stop, quote, this evil genocide, unquote. Israel faces a genocide case at the International Court of Justice over its year-long assault on Gaza, which, according to local officials in the Hamas-governed enclave, has killed at least 42,344 Palestinians and wounded another 99,013, with thousands more missing. Responding to the new letter on social media Tuesday, the Institute for Middle East Understanding Policy Project noted that the United States Agency for International Development and the State Department's Bureau of Population, Refugees and Migration, quote, recommended ending weapons to Israel months ago for these violations, unquote. Quote, Blinken ignored them and lied to Congress about their findings, unquote. The group said, quote, we should not wait 30 days. U.S. law requires ending the weapons now, unquote. Georgia State Representative Rua Roman, who is Palestinian-American, agreed. She declared, do it now. There's 370 days of evidence. The hundreds of thousands of people being starved in Gaza won't survive 30 more days. There's no more time to wait. Israel is exterminating Palestinians right now. This is from Justice Democrats. For 374 days, to tweet. Israel has used U.S. weapons to violate international law. You want to placate voters before an election? Show us what new democratic leadership could look like and end this genocide now. This is another quote tweet, okay, of the Barak Ravi tweet that I quoted before. Outgoing Congressman Jamal Bowman, who lost his June primary to a pro-Israel candidate backed by lobbyist money, also argued Tuesday that 30 days is too long to wait and see if we will impose an arms embargo. How many more Palestinians are we going to allow Israel to murder in 30 days, unquote, he asked, and quote again, how many more children and families and generations? We need an arms embargo now, unquote. And of course, I have to agree, and I also have to point out that 30 days from now is after the election. After the election. This is a move by the administration to indicate that it's going to do something. But why the 30 days? Because if they can wait for 30 days, then but the election is over and the pressure has left them to do something for the Palestinian and Arab vote here in the United States. They're currently losing that vote. And they're making this move because they know that if they can wait for 30 days, they can back off doing it at all. And in case of an escalation by Israel, causing Iran to retaliate, you can be sure that after the election, they're not going to impose, an arms embargo, even though arms shipments to Israel will continue to be illegal under U.S. law. Confident that the Republican Party would not impeach Joe Biden for breaking U.S. law in this respect, the administration will go ahead and continue to break the law. I think we need to, well, I won't even say it because it's simply futility. The idea would not work. Okay, anyway, that finishes that particular article. It's obviously a transparent move to try to placate voters, but as placation, it's completely inadequate because everybody knows they won't have to do anything after the election and there won't be consequences. So, once more, they're insulting our intelligence. And even when it says hashtag arms embargo now, Lana says, what do you think about how close the polls are? I don't think the polls are really so close. I think the polling averages are deceptive because, well, for example, just a few days ago, there was a piece that pointed out correctly. Okay, there are very many polls now. A count of those polls showed 30 of the polls were nonpartisan polls. 26 of the polls were partisan, but on the Republican side. And one poll was partisan, but on the Democratic side. So the Republican partisan polls are showing smaller leads for Harris or leads for Trump. The nonpartisan polls are generally speaking showing larger leads for Harris. So the average which is being reported by aggregators of the polling results is terribly biased towards the Republican polls. We know this. It's quite plain. If I had to guess, and I haven't been specializing in analyzing the polls, I've been paying attention to them. I've been watching them. I've been watching commentaries on them. I've been watching commentaries on voting trends and things like that. But I've been devoting myself to the study of, international relations, and I haven't had time for watching the polls as closely as I might like. But my sense of things is that Harris, on the national level, if you threw away all the Republican polls from the averages, that she would average maybe 4 or 5 points in national polls. Now, she probably needs to average about maybe 7 or 8 points to have a decisive win in the Electoral College. I think she has a chance to get it. I watched a performance of hers in Erie, Pennsylvania, which is a sort of a barometer county, in Pennsylvania. And the energy for her campaign that came out of that event was awesome. It was reminiscent of the kind of energy we used to see for Bernie Sanders, and that we never saw for Hillary Clinton in the whole of her campaign, that we never saw for Joe Biden in the whole of his campaign. There was a lot of energy, in Erie, Pennsylvania, which, as I said, is kind of a barometer county for the state. It's not as democratic a county, as Allegheny or some of the suburban counties, or Philadelphia. It has though plenty of Democratic support in it, but plenty of support for the Republicans also. Okay, so it's a barometer county. But this year, I feel certain that county is going to go for her, and that the state is going to go for her also. So I think the polls are underestimating Democratic support, in particular in taking account of the influence, of the abortion issue. That's been dogging the Republicans, in every election since the decision was made, the Dobbs decision in 2022, the summer of 2020. I guess it was in June of 2022. Since then, every special election has been underestimating Democrat support. In the Republican primaries as well, Trump did not perform nearly as well as he was expected to do. Of course, he beat everybody. There was no one really to challenge him. But still, he did not get the level of support in the primary elections that he was expected, to get. So there was an overestimation of support for Trump there, as well. And in special elections in 2023, there was an underestimation, of Democratic support. So I think the Democrats will do better than expected, and that there will be a substantial victory in the Electoral College for Kamala. Having said that, I want to record my resentment for having to tolerate that choice for this election. I worked hard not to have that kind of choice for this election. But we got it anyway. People didn't pay attention, to the Dump the Corruption movement. And so we got the two major parties completely dominating things again and putting in their candidates. And on the Democratic side, a very undemocratic decision to select Kamala Harris as the nominee, the Democrats. I have to say that I think she's run a good campaign. I don't know if any of the other contenders would have run quite as good a campaign. I've been surprised by her at the campaign level. I think that I've been infuriated by her in terms of how she's treated the genocide issue. I do understand why she treated it in that way, but I have no real indication that she would depart from Joe Biden's policies once she is the president of the United States. So Lana says, aha, good to know. I don't think the average person knows that. John B. says, it's a forlorn hope the U.S. government will ever conform to U.S. law when it suits it to do otherwise. The U.S. governance doesn't even respect or enforce the founding Constitution. Yes, John B., I entirely agree. Lana pointed out that Matt Waldy, said Karl Rove endorsed Kamala. I couldn't find that yesterday. Have you heard anything about that? But no, I haven't heard anything about that. But it doesn't surprise me at all. They're all coming over. Okay, all of the Republicans who've basically been cast out of the party, okay, are coming over to Kamala at this point because they want to end the rule of MAGA in their party and take it back. And that's what is going on here. Lana says J.D. Vance came to Minneapolis and talked some crap yesterday or the day before, and she says, ugh. So I have to ask you, if he came to Minneapolis, how is the level of energy, okay, at his appearance? It would be interesting to know that. Evelina says, yes, the abortion issue has Democrats wagging their tails. Oh, yes, it does. But I mean, I think for many women, that issue uh, 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 is a life or death issue. Okay, and really, no woman knows if it's going to be a life or death issue for her. So, in the States, where getting an abortion is illegal, and there are very few, if any, exceptions. There's a risk to living in that state for women of childbearing age. Why would those women ever vote to retain that particular risk? Is voting for a political party really that important that you're willing to take an unnecessary risk to your very life? I mean, I don't see it.
What about the children?
And Bonnie says, but what about the children? Lana says, I didn't see it in person, but Vance in Minnesota. Well, thank you all for coming tonight. There was very good attendance of late. My streams have been getting a lot more attendance. I am certainly grateful. Okay, I need to grow far more than this, of course. But I'm certainly grateful for those of you who have been coming, and I'm grateful for your comments. John B. says, the choice between two lesser evils, quote unquote, can generate no enthusiasm from decent people who would queue for hours to vote for big party stooges. Nothing will fundamentally change a rare Biden truth. I'm afraid that's true, John B. If change is to occur, we have to change it. And we have to change it with the Dump the Corruption movement. That's what we need to do. Evelina says it's a big issue for me too, but we need a federal law which promotes it, and the Dems haven't come through. I have to say that I do think if the Dems retain control, of the Senate and get control, of the House, and Kamala is elected, I do think that they will pass a law that codifies Roe at long last. I do believe that she is sincere about that and will have the party stop playing its games and using the issue as just a fundraiser. I do think she will stop that, and that change is going to exist. But what I have no indication of is that she will improve the foreign policy situation and get us off the risk of nuclear war once again. For years, that risk was minuscule, and it has grown. Uh, it grew actually through. Thanks. It grew at first somewhat during the Trump administration. Uh, 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 because of the foreign policy aspects there, the hostility towards China, the Israel policy. Okay, it grew there, but the risks really came into full flower in the Biden administration. The Biden foreign policy has been the worst the United States has had in many, uh, many years, and that is saying a lot because I think that we've had a terrible foreign policy uh, uh, since Jimmy Carter. But I think the Biden policy in exposing us to the risk of nuclear war once again has just been unforgivable. Unforgivable. John B. says U.S. government is a multi-billion-dollar fraud. There is no civil way left to oust the criminal cabals directing U.S. law. Well, I disagree there. The dump the corruption campaign that I envisioned is a way to oust them. It's a way to get rid of big money in politics by defeating all those who are taking the big money of whatever party. And I still believe that that is what we have to do. On that note, I'm going to say goodbye, say goodnight. I thank you all for attending tonight. I will be back on Thursday. John B. says they won't let you succeed. No, they won't even be aware of the movement until it's too late, John B. I mean, it won't be on their radar. It won't be on their radar. I mean, who am I? I'm nobody. What I'm trying to do is to organize hosts, in alternative media to all join the campaign. And once there are many alternative hosts, they won't be able to control it. It'll be too big. Evelina says good night, and John B. says, I wish you luck. Thank you, John B. On that note, I'm going to end the stream.